Hello. Hopefully you're there seeing us. Welcome to a conversation with Francis Spufford and Rowan Hisayo Buchanan. We're going to be talking about writing the city. All subjects about how creative writers can approach the idea of approaching urban environments. Writing cities through history, writing the maze of a city, all sorts of different areas we can chat about today. My name's Thomas McMullen. I'm a writer and one of the coordinators at CityLit, and this is my colleague Phyllis Richardson, who's also one of the coordinators with the department. I'll just give a brief introduction to our two guests today. So Francis Spufford started off as a writer of non-fiction in the 1990s, but has gradually morphed into a novelist. Sounds like a painful process. Golden Hill, set in 18th century New York, won the Costa First Novel Award in 2016 and two other book prizes. The London set Light Perpetual, his most recent book, won the Encore Award for Best Second Novel in 2022. He teaches creative writing at Goldsmiths College. Rowan Hisayo Buchanan is the author of Harmless Like You, the winner of the Authors Club First Novel Award and a Betty Trask Award. It was a New York Times Editor's Choice and an NPR 2017 Great Read. Her second novel, Starling Days, was shortlisted for the Costa Novel Award. Her work has appeared in several places, including Granta, Guernica, The Atlantic, and NPR's Selected Shorts. She is also the editor of the Go Home anthology. So we're going to start with a couple of readings. Rowan, I believe you're going to read first, if that's okay.
Yes, I am. So I'm going to read from my second novel, Starling Days, and I'm going to read from the opening, so you don't need to know anything at all. The only thing I will say is the book begins in quite a dark place, so if that's not a thing that you're up for on a Thursday night and you want to go make yourself some tea and biscuits and come back in 5 minutes and listen to Francis, I won't know and I won't be offended. But let me begin. So, Starling Days. She wasn't expecting the bridge to shudder. It was too big for trembling. Cars hissed from New York to New Jersey over its wide back. That August had been hot, 96 Fahrenheit hot. Heat softened the dollar bills and clung to the quarters and dimes that passed from sticky hand to sticky hand. It was night and the air had cooled, but humidity still hung in a red fog in Mina's lungs. Wind galloped over the Hudson, pummeling the city with airy hooves. The bridge shifted. The pylons swayed, and Mina closed her eyes to better feel her bones judder. Even her teeth shook. The day's sweat shivered between her bare shoulder blades. The tank top felt too thin, and the down on her arms rose. She took a step forward along the bridge. The tender spots between her big and index toes were sore from too many days in flip-flops. She took the sandals off. They swung from her fingers as she walked. Under her feet, the rough cement was warm. She wondered about the people driving their shadowy cars. Were they leaving over air-conditioned offices or bars cooled by the thwack of ceiling fans? Were they going home to empty condos or daughters tucked under dinosaur quilts? The bridge was decked out in blue lights like a Christmas tree, like those monochrome ones shopping malls put up. Still, it was beautiful. Mina readied her phone to take a picture. She watched the granulated night appear on screen. Perhaps her hands wobbled, because the photo was a blur. It was nothing she could send Oscar. She wasn't sure it was a good idea to send him pictures. Not tonight. She stopped in the middle of the bridge. Hello, Manhattan. Downriver, apartment blocks spiked upwards. She couldn't see Queens and the walk-up apartment building she'd grown up inside. Nor could she see the Park Slope apartment in which Oscar was working late. He'd have a mug on his desk, the coffee gone cold hours ago. The photo of her would be propped up behind his computer. The sparkly stress ball she'd bought him years ago as a joke gift would rest at his wrist. Every hour or so he'd roll it between his palms. When he was working, he didn't notice time. She was sure he wouldn't yet be worried. She'd said she was meeting some friends after the tutoring gig. He didn't know she'd texted the group that she was feeling unwell and would miss movie night. He wouldn't expect her for at least 2 hours. No one was expecting her. She was unwitnessed. She lifted her face to the breeze. The river was as dark as poured tarmac. They said that when a body fell onto water from this height, it was like hitting the sidewalk. Golden Gate had nets to stop jumpers. She imagined the feeling of a rope cutting into arms and legs. Your body would flop like a fish. How long did they have to lie there before someone scooped them out? There was nothing like that here. People said that drowning was a good death, that the tiny alveoli of the lungs filled like 1,000 water balloons. She lifted one purple flip-flop and dropped it over the water. She didn't hear it hit. The shape simply vanished into the black shadow. That was when the lights got brighter, and the voice, male and certain, lobbed into her ears. "Ma'am, step away from the rail." The police car's lights flashed blue and white and red. Once she'd had an ice pop those colours, and the sugary water had pooled behind her teeth. "Ma'am, step away from the rail." "Good evening, officer. Have I done something wrong?" Mina asked. "Please, get into the car," he said. There were 2 of them. The other was younger and was speaking to a radio. It was hard to make out his words over the wind and traffic. Was he talking about her? "This is a public walkway," Mina said. "It was open. I haven't done anything wrong." "Ma'am, get into the car." "I don't want to get into the car. Look, I was just getting some air. I was thinking, I'll go home now." "Ma'am, don't make me come over there." Mina had never been in a police car. She'd read once that the back doors only opened from the outside. Who knew what would happen if she got into the car? The window was rolled down and the cop stuck his head out. There was a lump on his upper lip. A pimple, perhaps? "Where are your shoes?" "It was hot out," she said. "Where are your shoes?" "I don't want to tell you about my shoes," she said. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm an American citizen." "Ma'am, where are your shoes?" She lifted up the single flip-flop she had left. "The other one broke," she said. Behind him, other cars continued into the night. Did they even notice her, standing in the dark, a small woman with bare legs and feet? She was aware of the blowing bruise she'd caught banging her knee on the subway door. In the shower that morning, she'd skipped shaving her legs. In the beam of his headlights, could he see her hair standing up in splinters? "Ma'am, I really need you to get in the car. I can't leave you here." "What if something happened to you?" In his voice, she heard the insinuation that normal women, innocent women, didn't walk alone on bridges at night. And I'll stop there. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Rowan. Thank you. Francis, if you're okay to read.
This is from Like Perpetual, my most recent novel. This bit comes from very near the end, for contrast. It's the last chapter in the strand of the book devoted to Joe, who very nearly became a rock star in the 60s, but came back to South London and became a secondary school music teacher instead. And this bit is happening when she is visiting her husband in hospital because he's been hospitalized again. His mental health is persistently dodgy, and she's thinking about her life and then going home by bus to the fictional borough of South London where the book happens. "I'd better make a move," says Jo. She drains the lukewarm last half-inch of her tea and levers herself out of the orange chair. "I'll just go and wash this up." "You don't have to," says the nurse. No, I will," Jo says, from some vague feeling that if she rinses the mug, it will make the place a tiny bit less institutional, symbolically, anyway. She is always glad to leave, always guilty that she gets to walk out while Claude stays behind, medicated. She carries her mug and his and 2 teaspoons through into the narrow kitchen that opens off the patient lounge. The instant coffee is in a catering-sized tub. The tea bags are in a Tupperware box. None of the mugs match. The biscuit tin has a sticker on top that says, "Neil's Biscuits, hands off." She washes up, she dries up with a tea towel bearing a picture of Carnarvon Castle. There's a window just to the right of the sink that looks back into the lounge, and through it she can see Claude framed in his chair like a badly lit still life. His narrow, quivering head, his big, incurious eyes, the nurse still standing over him. Probably the nurse is still there because he has not yet taken his pills. Probably he has not yet taken the pills because he wants to go on talking. Probably he is telling the nurse about Henry Kissinger. Yes, the nurse taps the pill pot arrested in Claude's hand, and Claude reluctantly lifts it to his mouth. And all of a sudden, with the last mug still in her hand, a message comes through loud and clear from Jo's psyche. This is an accident. There is no need for her life to have worked out like this at all. So many other possibilities. She could have stayed in LA. She could have had a solo career. She could have stayed in the band with Ricky if he had been slightly braver. She could have married Ricky and then, let's not kid ourselves, been divorced by Ricky and got that ludicrous white wedding cake of a house in Malibu in the settlement and be living there now, eating egg white omelettes and all purple meals for the antioxidants, you know, and showing off her collection of Fender guitars to rock biographers. Chance that she came back to London. Chance that she met Claude. Chance that she taught for 20 years at Bexford Hill. How can this be her life? How can that be her love if it rests on such accidents? Surely her real life is still waiting to happen. Surely she is still in the wings at the Pelican Club waiting to go on, or running across the common with Val and her tam o' shanter kicking at leaves. Surely the real thing has yet to come along. And then just as suddenly, just as clear, she thinks, so what? Nobody chooses who they love. Possessing something, being somebody, loving anyone, it rules the rest out. And so it's quieter than being young and looking forward and expecting it all. That's all. The world calms down when your choice is made. That's all. She puts away the last mug in the melamine cupboard and goes to say goodbye to Claude. See you on Monday, she says. See you on Monday, he echoes, and he watches her as she goes, puzzled, as if she knew something enormous that he does not. But later, on the bus back from Woolwich to Bexford, it returns, milder this time and more melancholic, a grief, a grievance, not a bolt of disbelief. On the top of the 54, up at the top, where she has always liked to sit on London's buses, to get that stilt walker's sway, that giraffe rider's ungainly perch above the street. She supposes that at some point when her hips go, she won't be able to make it up the stairs. For now, she can, though. And she sits surrounded by changing crowds of teenagers out for the start of Saturday night. White girls whose thongs show above the back of their low-rise jeans. God, what a stupid fashion. Black boys with heads shaved into cryptic sigils, getting off and on in obedience to the invisible frontiers of the postcode wars. Kids young enough now to be easily the children of the ones she taught when she first returned. And to all of them, her presence is an effective blank. She has no part in their very important games, and they treat her as if she were invisible. They chat, catcall, shout across and around the old woman with the white bob and the melanoma scar and the lips pressed together. Blotted lights of traffic and crossing signals float across the curved glass beside her, neon leaves on black water. Ahead, there is still a faint smear of light in the western sky, sunset remnants fading like a dim lamp behind stained glass. Brake lights stitch the way across Blackheath. Down the hill on the far side, and the panes of dim colour tip up and disappear behind the tree branches on the slope. By the time the 54 levels out at the bottom, the sky to the west and the east and the south and the north is the plain black static of the London night, fuzzed with sodium. Onward to Lewisham, and then the grind up the long gradual slope to Bexford. Underneath Saturday night, Underneath the fried chicken shops and the billboards and the railway arches, the geology of the city persists on its own timetable, scarcely scratched by the crackle glaze of brick and tarmac spread over the top. Bexford, Lewisham, Woolwich, permanent sounding names for gravel beds, left by the river's random swinging this way and that across a basin of clay between hills, for millions of years during which there were no names, no city, no humans. Here there was ice, pine forest, tundra, rainforest, tundra, ice again, over and over, and only in the very last iteration of the cycle, the faint grey thread of smoke rising from the first campfire, the first pinpoint of red in the London night. The city, the great city, is shallow lithography on the clay. The city is a mayfly veil. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Francis. So Phyllis, I think, has the first question, and also to the audience, if you did want to ask any questions at all during this, we'll have a Q&A session towards the end. So if you put them in the chat, we'll come to them a bit later. But yeah, over to you, Phyllis.
Hi there, welcome everyone, and thanks very much to Francis and Rowan for being here. Amazing passages that, sorry, I hate the word amazing, but really redolent of the city experience, which you've obviously chosen to read for us. So the first question we had was to do with wondering what is it that a city or an urban environment brings to a work of fiction. And that kind of put me in mind of Shakespeare setting some of his plays in the two locations, a city location and a country location, offering two worlds in which characters behave differently, in which some characters even had different identities in those two locations. So I wanted to ask, and I'd ask Rowan if you would answer first, are there things that can only happen in a city? And what does this urban environment bring to the work of fiction?
Thank you. So I'm hesitant to say that something can only happen in a city, because Agatha Christie has told us in her wisdom that everything happens in St. Mary's Mead that can happen to a person. And therefore, presumably, you know, it doesn't have to be a city. But that said, I have chosen to write about cities. And I think that's in part because I was born in London, I lived in New York, I spent a lot of time in these places, and they have given me my experience of life. And what I've noticed about cities, and that I find useful as a writer, is that cities aren't the poster you see in Heathrow with Big Ben and the bus and like maybe the London Eye as well, where, you know, you have this one capital city that has a particular set of values. You know, Hackney is different from the Square Mile, is different from Regent's Park, is different from Richmond Park, is different from Brick Lane. That there are so many cities within a particular city and so many experiences of the same places that are felt very differently by different characters. So for example, in my first novel, Harmless Like You, it has two protagonists, one of whom is a mother, and she's not a mother in her bits, she's a young woman in New York in the 1960s and 70s, and one of whom is her son much later. And for the mother, for Yuki, New York is an externally dangerous place. There are various things she has to deal with, people she has to deal with. She's Japanese at a time when it's not, you know, a super multicultural touchy-feely time, and she's a young woman alone without her parents at a time. Well, I think in all times that's not necessarily a super safe thing to be. Whereas her son experiences New York as being much more comfortable, but that he is the threat, and he does things that make people feel awkward, like try to give his baby to strangers. And so the city has the space to do different things for different characters, to move from somewhere that feels completely safe, somewhere that feels completely dangerous, and that there is so much room within that. And I find that as a fiction writer really useful and welcoming. That said, my third novel is coming out in April. It's all about a seaside town, so you know, sometimes you need to escape the city too.
Fantastic, really interesting. Okay, we'll wait for that. Francis, can you give us your take on what the city does for fiction?
Cities are where you live surrounded by strangers. Cities are the opposite of villages, where you are a known quantity and everyone you meet is a known quantity, and that, I think, is actually why Agatha Christie sets crime novels in villages, because they give you a finite suspect list, or she puts them in artificial villages like cruise liners or the Orient Express. Cities are where you live surrounded by strangers in an environment made up of rushing other humans who you don't know on common ground, and they are consequently places of freedom, but also places of loneliness and places of concentrated possibility, the bad ones, the bad possibilities as well as the good possibilities. Cities are where extremely dissimilar kind of human experiences and human destinies run closely alongside each other, usually without touching. But since fiction is in the business of making connections, fiction set in cities lets you join up your characters with here and there with strangers picked out of the rushing human mass that go by, and the city, one of us is going to say this, so I'll say it now, the city itself is often a character, a kind of collective being, made up of all of the kind of the accumulated, coagulated, different human experiences going on in at the same time, but also giving a particular quality to them. There is a kind of path dependency to city life, a culture of particular cities which directs human experience. It doesn't control it, it doesn't make it all one thing, but it takes the kind of enormous pluralistic flow of it and it channels it in particular ways. And there is not a mood of cities, but there are clusters of moods that go with particular cities. I invite you to consider the difference between a novel called Death in Venice and a novel called Death in Birmingham. And Death in Birmingham need not be funny, but it wouldn't be. It might be Peaky Blinders, but it wouldn't be about the particular wintry, foggy melancholy of ancient beauty and slightly decadent lives. Possibly I do Brummies a disservice here. Perhaps all of that stuff goes on a lot in the Bullring, but I suspect it's not foregrounded in the same way. This comes close to kind of the stereotypes of cities as well, but stereotypes exist because they've got grains of truth in them. Stereotypes are recognizable the way that caricatures are recognizable. But I write about cities because I want the combination of the close-in focus on particular characters and the possibility all the time of pulling out the zoom into something big and collective, and cities are kind of temporal constructions. They're made of layered time as well as being kind of spatial constructions, because cities wear their past in their buildings. So as well as the dissimilar mass of people going by, there are all the buildings which tell you what the city has been too. That's probably enough on that question, I think.
Thank you, Francis. And no, I love also the kind of mention of Agatha Christie and detective novels, because I guess for me, like, I think just that made me think the city is, I guess, like an incomprehensible force as well, and that the detective, you know, more of the kind of Sherlock Holmes or Edgar Allan Poe kind of model of like that rational force that comes in and kind of makes sense of a city. But actually the next question I had links to what you were talking there a little bit about history at the end. So this is a question for you, Francis, in that history's played a very large role in your work. 18th century New York and Golden Hill, and kind of different post-war incarnations in like Perpetual. When we look at a city, to what extent are we looking at its past, and how does that inform your writing process?
I'm a past-soaked person anyway, just as a matter of kind of temperament, and it doesn't have to be like that. Cities, particularly if you're young, can be the all-consuming present moment, where getting past the doorman at one particular doorway is the kind of the definition of happiness and success, or alternatively of misery. But I think the things that a city has been make themselves felt, like kind of, echoes getting more and more remote. And where a city has changed a lot, the kind of the haunting of the past can be quite surprising. Like Perpetual is a book about how London has changed over the last sort of 50 or 60 years, and how it turned into the kind of the cosmopolitan world city it is now, from being a kind of the sort of ruined capital of a mostly white empire in 1945, and the characters carry the past that made them, and the South London you can't see anymore in them and in their bones as they go. But my New York novel, the 18th century one, is partly playing a game with reversed expectations, because New York is the cosmopolitan city par excellence. It's the place you go to remake yourself, whether you're an immigrant who's just arrived at Ellis Island, or a hick who's just got off a Greyhound bus from somewhere in the heartland. Those are the two kind of stereotypical New York arrivals. But by writing an 18th century novel set at the very beginning of New York, I could turn it back into a village, and my protagonist is a Londoner who has urban expectations of a kind we recognize as kind of modern. I mean, he expects to be anonymous. He expects to be able to interact with people and then pass on and never see them again. And he's suddenly in a town of about 7,000 people, where everything he does is remembered, and where strangers, particularly ones who turn up in the winter with a great deal of money, are constantly news. And he finds himself in something much more like an Agatha Christie novel than he's expecting. And I knew when I was reading it, because it's New York, that the reader is not in the 18th century, so they were going to constantly remember the Manhattan they know, and there would be a kind of ghostly overlay of skyscrapers on my tiny little Georgian Dutch buildings. And I liked the mixture there. I liked haunting past New York with future New York. Or take a much more recent book. Rebecca Stott's Dark Earth is set in 6th century Londinium. I mean, it's basically a ruin. Hardly anyone's in it, and her protagonists, her characters, are a couple of Saxon young women who don't really get the enormous ruined thing next to them, but have to go and hide in it. And yet it's impossible to read that now without her kind of crumbling Roman remains being haunted by the city that now exists on that exact spot. That, Leadenhall Market with its Victorian roof in the city is on top of what was then a Roman basilica with a mosaic floor. It produces a kind of layered perception, kind of a sort of magic lantern effect, in which you see different bits of time superimposed on each other.
Yeah, and your reading there, I was struck by the line of permanent sounding names for gravel beds when describing, I think, the boroughs like Lewisham, and I guess is that kind of destabilization of perceived permanence? Does that feel quite key to what you want to do?
Yes, except that you need to take permanence on the human scale seriously too. So having destabilized it by kind of pulled out and gone, this is the blink of an eye, 70 years, which is about how old Joe is in that chapter. 70 years is nothing. Well, it's not nothing to Joe, and in a minute she's going to get off the bus and arrive at her front door, and we will be back on the temporal scale in which her life is immensely significant to her, and the destabilization is supposed to make it makes the, if I got it right, it makes the perspective kind of real for a minute, and then its head stops spinning, and you are once more looking at a black and red tile path leading up to a front door. Yeah, and I want both. I don't want to dismiss the scale of the ordinary. I want to kind of situate it. I want to pay attention to what's round it, which again is a city-ish thing to do, because everything in a city has things going on to left and right of it, which mostly we don't pay attention to, but sometimes they intrude. Sometimes somebody jumps in front of your tube train, or there's an argument on the tube train platform, or you look at your neighbor and they're a being of unearthly beauty on the tube and you think wistful thoughts and never see them again, or you talk to them and discover that they're there's no time to write the novel in question here, but yeah, any of that. Cities, they're you know, ancient hokey American TV series from the 1950s called The Naked City. There are a million stories in the naked city, but it's true. If not only a million, the cities are kind of immense basins of potential narratives.
Thank you very much, Francis.
Yeah, immense. Immense. And I was struck by when you were reading, both of you, in the beginning, you know, bridges, you know, traffic lights, you know, all of those elements that are, as you say, the strangers and the city intruding. And I was thinking of, Rowan, of your your opening, well, actually a bit farther on, when Francis was talking about how the characters carry the city with them. And I was thinking of when your characters in Starling Days move to London and they go into the flat, and there's the woman living next door who says, oh, you should have seen this place in the 80s. And I mean, how many of us have met one of those people in our neighborhood who says, oh, you should have seen it, you know, in the old days, kind of thing. So in your novels, you've written characters who deal with and try to overcome a sense of loneliness and isolation. You haven't only written that, but that's part of the characters. Do you feel that the urban experience contributes to this?
I mean, I don't want to come down and say, you know, you can't be a lonely shepherd. I'm pretty sure you can be. I haven't tried it, but it seems hard. But what I would say is that, you know, in movies, when usually like not that well produced movies, when the character is sad and it rains and you go, okay, fine, I get it, they're sad, they're in love and it's sunny, and you know, this pathetic fallacy, and you know, it can feel a bit on the nose. But I think that there's something about cities and their intrusions, sort of as Francis was talking about, where the intrusions that you end up allowing into your consciousness or allowing into your psyche do often amplify what you are feeling at the time. So there's a moment in Starling Days where when Mina is walking alone at night and she's very lonely. Her husband's kind of left her, and she's walking this dog, and she walks past a van that's full of meat, and the meat is like, and this is not like nicely packaged Tesco's meat, it's for the butcher, and they're all hanging down and there are hooves, and for a moment she thinks feet, and like, oh no, animals. And it's a very ominous moment for her, and it's one in which she basically runs away from. And this isn't a thriller. The man in the van doesn't come out and butcher her and hang her up on the hooks, but it is amplifying her sense of feeling hunted in that moment. And I think, to me, that felt plausible in a way that having it rain wouldn't, because I think she could very well walk by that van on a nice day when she's feeling happy, and it wouldn't mean something entirely different. But the city tends to give you what you're looking for, can give you what you're feeling. Equally, sort of on the other side, there's a woman she becomes quite obsessed with, and when she sees that woman in a crowd, it's like that space has come to frame her, and the entire city is saying, look at this beautiful woman. And so I think for me, the city is a way of, we often put our own emotions on the city and it sort of speaks back to us. That said, I don't want to get on Francis's "the past is important" train, but it is. And you know, I don't go quite as far back in history in my writing, but you know, even in a city, you have to think about the decisions that were made by people long before your characters were born will be still affecting your characters. There's a moment at the end of the book where it's incredibly important that these characters are in sort of 1960s, 1970s tower block that wasn't built that great. And one of the two parents can hear the other one on the floor above. And the being able to hear changes what's going to happen at the end of that book. And, you know, if they just invested in more expensive building materials, this novel would have happened entirely differently. And so your characters, whether or not you choose to look at it or focus on it, are always moving through, in the city, always moving through the world of other people's human choices and other people's consequences. And that can be something you choose to let into your writing and sort of give you more of a sense of the world around them. At least, so that's what I think anyway.
Yeah, fascinating. I think really fascinating. The way that you describe characters going through and just being kind of maybe not accosted by all of these things, but certainly it feels like a pinball machine almost. You go and you're bumping up against architecture and people and other elements. And I wonder if those, with your characters, Rowan, if those characters are that bumping up against kind of reinforces what if they're feeling lonely or unhappy, or
I think reinforces, but also without sort of psychoanalyzing the book too much. So the two protagonists are the woman Mina, who you heard from in the beginning, and she's obviously very interrupted by the police. Something different would have happened if they hadn't intruded in that moment. And her husband Oscar, and they moved to London. Oscar is British, Mina's American, and London means something very different for him than it means for her. But it's not just that she goes to London and sees everything she's feeling again in London. She goes to London because there's a desire to change, to break out of the moment that you guys listened to. And in meeting various people in London, pulling in old acquaintances, the woman I mentioned shows up. And Mina clings to both that woman and to the city of London as, this is going to fix it, this is going to change it. And she's asking not to have it just happen again, but say, this could be different, your life could be different. And I think, you know, again, Francis has said many brilliant things already. You know, that's something that, you know, Francis was talking about a bit, is that cities do offer this hope of you could be a new person. And sometimes that hope is a little sketchy. Maybe you can, maybe you can't, but it's definitely there. And I think that's an interesting pull to me.
I think the hope of it stays there, even if it's constantly disappointed. I think it's one of the ways in which kind of mourning in cities, I mean MORNING, new days in cities look as if everything could be new again. And even though it's mostly a delusion, it never quite goes away. Cities are where it looks as if things can restart. There's a passage in The Great Gatsby, which I was looking for on my office shelf just over there and couldn't find. But it's the famous passage where they are driving into the city over probably the bridge that Mina is considering jumping off. And he says that the sight of the city is always the city seen for the first time, the city with its promise still on it, saying that your life could be transformed. But it's not, I mean, it's not just New York that does that. I feel a kind of rule coming on, because I really like what you were saying about the pathetic fallacy, but cities are where the weather that makes up the pathetic fallacy is human weather. It's where other people provide the equivalent of the equivalent of rain, or storms, or lightning.
Talking, I guess, jumping on that thing of the promise of the city. I mean, we've talked a bit about the past and kind of history of inner city, but kind of also like looking forward to, I guess, our changing relationship with cities, particularly against, you know, the backdrop of climate crisis. I'd be curious to what extent you think our relationship with cities has changed in recent years. How do you think this will change in the future? And what challenge does it present to a writer, that changing face of the city? I don't know, Rowan, if you wanted to take this first of all.
Sure. So I think that obviously the challenge to a writer will depend on the sort of writer they are. And we need all of us. We need the people who are going to write the very incisive tweets and the people who are going to write hardcore, well-researched essays. And, you know, I think that's, I don't want to say how a writer should handle the climate crisis, but something that I think about a lot is other major changing events. And, you know, you think, what can a novelist do? What can someone who's writing about feelings do? And I think about Muriel Spark and The Girls of Tender Means, which takes Slender Means, which takes place just after the war, but the war is still very, very, very much present in that book. And it's a funny book, and it's a mean book, and the humans are so human and gossipy, and because it's not the post-war of the grand poster, you know, and yet you can see into buildings that have just had their sides bombed off. You know, rationing is still a thing. And I think that is what a novelist is one of the things a novelist can do, is take these huge, in some cases, in the case of tragedies or challenges or changes that can barely be can't wrap your head around, and say, okay, this is a person and they're living through it, and this is how it's affecting them. And it can give you, at least me, a reader, something to hold on to, whether it's something that I'm dealing with in my own life or something from the past, where you can begin to think about it. You can begin to go, okay, well, how is this? What does it mean, other than just all caps, I have to hide under my desk now? And, you know, I think when we saw this a little bit with the writing about COVID, at first we saw, at least I saw, a lot of writing that was trying to say, this is what COVID is, this is what COVID means for everyone. And then you started to see pieces of work where, yeah, you saw that people were starting to deal with all of the stuff they had to deal with before, but now also they're wearing masks and people might get sick. And, you know, it gives us a way to think about that in the context of everything else. Otherwise it becomes something that's just sort of isolated. And right now we're thinking about the climate crisis, and now we're not thinking about the climate crisis. So I think, you know, and instead that it's going to be part of it is part of all our lives, and it's increasingly going to be part of all our lives. I can't say exactly how that will change the city in particular, but I think that's something that, when I'm looking at climate fiction rather than sort of think pieces, that's something I'm really drawn to as a reader.
If it's going to be the background of all our lives, then I suppose it will be the background of all of the different kinds of stories that we tell as well. And it won't mean one thing. It will be as different as the stories it's in, but it will continue to make sense of it at the, you know, within the scope that novels do well, which is a few individual people known well, and behind them the mirror being carried up the street, which Vida Storndal said novels did. Notice that it's a street, and therefore probably a city street, not a village street, because you want quite a lot of different things in your mirror. There's a lot of very good descriptions of urban heat already, but I suspect some of the best climate fiction will come out of big African cities and big Chinese cities and big Indian cities rather than European cities, places which feel it sooner and more sharply perhaps than we will here. But some of them will be lyrical, and some of them will be comedies, and some of them will be soap operas, and some of them will try for the big picture. I'm generalizing here about not generalizing because.
No, thank you very much. Thank you both. I think maybe the best thing now would be to go on to a few of the questions that are coming in from people in the audience. So please, if you do have any questions, do put them in the chat box and we'll be able to see them. We've got a question here from Maria Thomas. Rowan, you teach a course at City Lit called Writing the City. What advice or tips would you give to a writer who wants to try and capture an urban environment in their work?
Okay, so I mean, there are many different ways to do it. Francis has written about a city that at a time in history where he could absolutely not have gone and visited it. But when I'm doing that course, something that I ask my students to do is, given we're in London, to go out and to observe. We look a little bit at Anna Kinsella's book, Look Here, which is a non-fiction book, but she has all these sort of notes and observations about things overheard, things seen in the city. And to go and to make these sort of verbal sketches and then to put them into fiction and to give them to characters. So, for example, that van, I saw that van, but I wasn't about to go stalk someone I was in love with when I saw it. And think, okay, what if someone in a slightly different environment, this is a different emotional state than me, a character who's going through a particular thing, what if I put them in this space? How would it shake them up? How would it affect them? How would it push them, move them? What dangers are there in this space? So a bridge is not a danger, and it is also a danger. And do I want to activate that part of something that I've seen? And the reason I have them do that is because for me, as a writer, I make up characters, I make up plots, I don't make up places. I need to be able to feel grounded in the world. And I don't think that everyone does, but I sort of give my students let's play with that. Let's give yourself the confidence of going, this is a real place. And I can be surprised by that place, and I can find beauty within it, and I can find danger within it, and I can choose what I pull out, what I exaggerate, what I minimize, what I push back. And that can, make a scene feel much more specific than if it's just sort of happening, the two characters chatting in an abstract cafe somewhere. And B, it can give you the confidence of thinking, okay, I don't know what happens next. Well, the city's going to intrude, so something's going to happen. They can't stay static. So I sort of give them that to play with. And so, yes, so if you wanted to try it, I do recommend it.
And I guess similarly, maybe Francis, if you had any, I guess it's from, kind of technical writer perspective, like any tips or prompts or kind of ideas of how to approach writing the city.
I mainly want to say what she said about Rowan. I think the idea of the verbal sketch is a very useful one. Walk, I think, is a good idea. Your actual literal feet on actual literal pavements. You're right, I couldn't visit 18th century New York, but I did walk around present day Lower Manhattan with an 18th century street map with my eyes mostly on the pavement, and it worked surprisingly well. The street plan is the same, even if all the buildings are different. And again, if the things you harvest can be remixed by being given to characters and put in completely different contexts. There's a passage in my book which comes from me sitting on a bench on the Circle line and waiting for a train and getting the one I didn't want, and it was rush hour, the doors opened, and I found myself wondering how you describe all of the faces you can see in the kind of 45 seconds before the doors shut again. And the train left and the next one came and it was mine, but I by then I'd taken out my notebook and was frantically attempting to annotate 20 odd people so I could remember them. And then I gave it to somebody else in whose life it means something specific, rather than just being a kind of harvested verbal sketch waiting to be used. Walk, observe. This is obvious, but as Rowan said, the famous landmarks that you see in shiny posters at Heathrow are not what you want to be looking at. Ideally, there's some sort of combination of qualities you want in which you look for what is characteristically ordinary about a city, and then you find ways of describing it that kind of make people see it as if freshly. Like the comparison of the surface of the East River to black asphalt in the nearly bridge jumping scene that we began with. It's the same old water as ever, but seen newly, and you want to see ordinary stuff as if it were striking somehow.
Thank you very much. Phyllis, I don't know if any of the questions you wanted to pull out at all. If not, I'm happy to.
Sorry about that. There's a question from Nell, which contains part of the question you've already answered, but for either one of you, how do you choose which city you want to write about? And what usually comes first, the city or the story? Rowan, do you want to start on that one? City or the story?
Ooh, I think for me, I usually have an image in my head before I begin anything of a character standing and looking at something, which sounds very passive when I say it like that, but I have to figure out why they're and feeling something. And I usually have to then sort of figure out to myself, why do they feel like that? What is it about the thing they're looking at, or about them that's summoning this emotion? Which means that I sort of get character and place at once, and then I have to go plot. Why are they feeling these things? What are they going to do with these feelings? Who are they going to meet? And then I sort of have to claw my way into a plot from there. But I think place is very much there from the beginning, which might explain why I've mostly written about places where I spent some time, even if it's not in a historical period in which I'm currently living. And even the book that's set in the seaside town, I spent a lot of time on the British coast, hanging out, looking at crumbly cliffs and being slightly cold while seagulls glared at me, so that I could feel in that place. It is so integral to the story.
Unmuted. There are people whose imaginations are not very place driven, and those work fine, but they tend not to be drawn towards writing the kind of stories in which the setting is almost a character. I get plots fairly early on, and the plots partly dictate what I'm looking at and what I'm looking for, and I usually know where I'm going to end, and setting as an element of that, but not how I get to where I'm going. So there is still a remaining kind of element of discovery in it. I've written about places I've lived and know well, and places I haven't lived, and not just the ones that are in the past. The thing I've just finished writing is set in a completely imaginary city, and there is a kind of pleasure in the challenge to the imagination in coming up with something that feels various enough to be real, because real things are heterogeneous. So if you want to invent something, you are competing slightly with the real mixture of the real world. But cities aren't easily exhausted. There's a lot of human stuff packed in, very close and accessible to the writer. I would find it much more difficult to write something set in the countryside about a lonely shepherd, or an intensely gregarious shepherd. But
there's a name for a novel, the intensely
gregarious shepherd.
Or a pub. I've got a question here from Dave Wakely. Love the comments and thoughts about cities and their histories. Thank you, Dave. What are the challenges and opportunities that Rowan and Francis see in writing new towns? So I kind of, maybe it goes off what you were just saying there, Francis, about kind of inventing a city, but I guess also it could be about, you know, we've kind of talked of cities as places, you know, like you know, the kind of ones that have been around for ages. But what about, you know, somewhere which doesn't, you know, which is kind of, you mentioned kind of Chinese cities earlier, but places that have really just exploded in terms of size and become cities, or cities that indeed you've invented yourself. But I guess where there isn't a kind of ready history to dip into, is that present any challenges or opportunities for you in your writing? Oh, you're on mute, Francis.
Lucky, really, because I don't have anything sensible to say for a moment. It's different, isn't it? It's different from inventing a city with an invented past as well. But there is something there. It's a different kind of mutation of the F. Scott Fitzgerald thing about the city representing possibility. If you've got a street in a new estate where the people who move into the houses are the first people who have ever lived in those houses, everything is still to happen. The kind of first threads of life and kind of community or anti-community are being woven in front of you, and that somehow throws a more audible question mark onto what those people are going to be able to manage in that place. It's like kind of you've got a test tube for a human community, and a question about what people will be able to make of it. I mean, historically, new towns, some new towns are quite old now. If you want to write something set in Letchworth Garden City in 1905, you could, and they're more uniform. A novel set in Stevenage or Letchworth Garden City comes in some ways with a more kind of given character to the setting. There is a more uniform mood in there against which the current lives may play with a more kind of deliberate irony. If you are writing about Cumbernauld in just outside Glasgow, and you're writing a grim novel of decay and heroin addiction, then the fact that the architecture is going 1960s idealism, modernism, everything will be great, gives you a built-in sort of overhanging irony. It may not be what you want, but it's you'd have to negotiate it. Yeah, I think that's probably that exhausting.
Yeah, and Rowan, maybe in terms of your third novel, I don't know how much you want to talk about it, but I'm curious about the seaside town. Is that a town that you've invented, or is it a kind of real seaside town?
So it is. It's a bit of an amalgam, largely because actually, in some ways, I feel like you can write about London and you can say this is my London or this is my character's London, and most people will let you get away with it. If you write about someone's small town and you do not represent their small town as they see it, and I'm not saying in a bad way, that people feel defensive of that. And I thought, I don't want to write about Whitstable, for example, and then add a building that isn't in Whitstable and have all of the residents of Whitstable feel like that building isn't here, please stop misrepresenting Whitstable at once. And so I spent quite a lot of time in various different seaside towns, and the book is definitely set in England, but I spent a fair amount of my childhood up near Nairn. So bits of that are sort of woven together into a fictional town that, if you want to see your seaside town in it, you can. If you're like, my seaside town's much better than this one, I welcome you to feel that way too. And so there was, so it was a bit of a process of invention, but one of the things I wanted to do with it is still have it be grounded in some form of reality. So the family that it's about have moved there from the city, from London, as many people, well, specifically my age, have been doing recently, because they can't quite make it work in the bigger cities. But at the same time, they're not locals whose grandmothers have been born in this one town for thousands of years, nor are they posh holiday makers who can then leave. Like, this is where they are. This is where they are trapped now. And so I was sort of quite interested in that, where the town isn't new. It's an old town, but people are trying to, in a very different way than when you go to New York, invent a life, invent some form of security, invent some form of safety that may or may not be possible or be there. And there are pre-existing people and all of that. But I just wanted to say something brief to the original question about new towns, which is that I used to be an intern in in the marketing section of an architecture firm, and I was working on one project that was about a town that had been built in Korea that was brand new. A bunch of posh architects had built this thing, had built schools, and there was a thesis behind the town and an idea of what they wanted that town to be and the sorts of people who they wanted that town to attract. And I think if I was to write about a new town, I might not necessarily write about that one, but even if you never meet the people who decide the sort of town and the sort of people, I imagine that one's characters might end up pushing up against that or playing with that a little bit. And you might see the flaws in some of that vision as well as the opportunities. I think Luke Kennard does quite a good job with that in some of his work. He has sort of like utopias and areas that are designed by people where they don't allow you to have cars, which is probably a good thing for the environment, but interesting in the small town area. And also, nowhere is new. There's nowhere's new. We haven't built more earth. So even if the town is new, there was land, there were people, and they can rear up if you want them to. Anyway.
Thank you very much. We're probably pretty much out of time. I did just have a final, very brief question that's maybe just a kind of, little ender question. Is, I guess, what's your favourite city in a book? Favourite city in a novel? So is it, James Joyce's Dublin? Is it, Francis, you first. Oh, you're on mute again. Is this your way not to answer it?
It could be, because I want to cheat and just go favourite for what? There are too many cities. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to say Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, with its endless series of kind of permutations and combinations, which are all really different versions of Venice. It's like kind of 100 Venices.
Brilliant, thanks, Francis. And Rowan, what about you?
My brain does freeze up if anyone asks me my favorite thing, because I think I'll walk away and I'll go, oh my God, that was not my favorite thing at all. It was this other thing. I'm totally wrong. But a book about a city that I really liked is 20 Fragments of a Ravenous Youth by Xiaolu Guo. And it's about a young woman growing up in China in a city that's very much exploding, in which there is ambition and poverty and hunger for food and also for ambition. And I think she, in general, as a writer, writes very well about sort of finding your place in a city or not finding your place in a city. In her more recent book, A Lover's Discourse, is about a couple, one of whom is Chinese and one of whom is European, trying to find a home in London and moving around on a canal boat as a compromise between stasis and movement. And I think she does the city very well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both, and yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Just to reassure a few people that have asked on the question about if it's recorded, it is indeed being recorded. So this will be up if you wanted to share it with people who aren't here, or if you wanted to watch it again. And thank you everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evenings. I'll click end, so we'll be kicked out into the void. But thank you very much. It's been really interesting.
Thank you. Glad your computer lasted, Francis. Thank you. Thanks, Rowan. Good night, everyone.
Bye.